So thank you all so much for joining us today for Armchair Travel to Yucatan, Mexico with the Traveling Librarian. Join Jeff Klapes, the Traveling Librarian, for his newest Armchair Travel presentation. This series highlights travel photography and stories and travel tips about destinations around the world. This month, travel to Yucatan, Mexico. Merida, located in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, is a vibrant city known for its colonial architecture, rich cultural heritage, and proximity to ancient Mayan ruins. The surrounding area is home to several significant archaeological sites, as well as some charming towns. And I'm not going to attempt to pronounce any of these. So Jeff is the retired head of reference services at the Lucius Beebe Memorial Library in Wakefield, and he's an avid traveler and photographer. And I again want to thank the Friends of the Library for sponsoring. So all 100 plus of us who are watching live and the hundreds who will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jeff for joining us this afternoon. And Jeff, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me again. Welcome, everybody. I see actually there's somebody tuning in from the Yucatan. So welcome. I don't know if you're native or just visiting there, but I hope you'll chime in with comments or corrections if I say anything wrong. I'd be curious to know what your experiences are there. So as Robert said, do feel free to put anything in from into the chat or the Q&A as we go through. I'll try and keep an eye on questions or comments, but I'll stick around at the end of the program as well. With no further ado, I will dive in. Oh, I should share my screen. You might like that. Okay, there we go. And we will get started. This is a trip I actually took very recently, just in this past December, just a couple months ago, because I was trying to escape the cold up here in Boston, and I had a free flight. So believe it or not, there are direct flights. Oh no, I take it back. Well, there are direct flights to the Yucatan, but I flew into Merida, which does not have direct flights. But it's a very easy trip from Boston. It's just a couple hours to Miami, and then a couple hours more direct into from there into Merida, which is where I stayed for the time that I was there, about 10 days. You can fly direct into Cancun because that's a much busier touristy destination. But we're actually not going to focus on the beaches today. We're going to focus on the inland and colonial towns and some of the natural beauty and also the historical sites that are in that area. To put it on the map, this is to show you, just as a reminder, where the Yucatan is. It's made up of three of the, I forget how many states there are in Mexico, but it's made up of three of them. Yucatan is the one here. There's also Quintana Roo, which is the one on the coast here, and also Campeche. The geography it's very flat, interestingly. We're going to talk a little bit more about the history and the culture there and how it is affected by the geology there. Merida is the capital, which is where I stayed. It's not too far from the coast, but it is not on the coast. And with Massachusetts overlaid on top of it, it gives you a rough idea of the size. It isn't actually that big an area. So if you are interested in traveling around either by bus or renting a car or by taking the new train, which I'll talk about, it's not actually that big an area, and you can travel around it fairly easily. Most tourists tend to focus on the coastline along here, Cancun, Playa del Carmen, down to the Mexican ruins, the Mayan ruins rather, at Tulum. It's a very touristy area. It's mostly beach resorts and bars and that kind of thing, which is certainly very popular, and you might enjoy that, but I was going for a different reason. So that's why we're going to focus on other things. And you can see from a topographical map here that it really is, most of this peninsula is flat as a pancake. It's a limestone plateau that is not very high at all and doesn't really get high until you get to the hills and mountains down along the Pacific coast down here. And here you can see the area that I traveled around. Again, I stayed in Merida, which is a wonderful city that I'll show you shortly. It is convenient to the coast. You can easily get to the beaches along the north coast if you want. But it is also a very good base if you want to explore some of the Mayan ruins that are in the area and a number of the Spanish colonial towns that are inland. The name Yucatan for the peninsula, which the locals will joke about actually saying being Yucatan, obviously that's a bad joke. But the name probably comes, they don't know exactly where the name comes from, but the most common theory is that when the Spanish arrived from Europe, Cortez and various other explorers, they asked the locals what the name of this place was, and because of the incomprehension between the two languages, the locals said something along the lines of, "We have no idea what you're talking about," which the Spanish interpreted as Yucatan or something close to it. Whether it makes a great story, whether it's true or not is hard to say. But you'll see a lot of the Spanish influence in the whole area, of course, as throughout most of Central America. I stayed in a really nice guest house in Merida, in a neighborhood called Santiago. This is called Casa Tres Colibríes, which is Spanish for the three hummingbirds. And it's an old family home, very typical of the neighborhood. $65 a night with a homemade breakfast and air conditioning. It was fantastic. Here is my delightful hostess, Giovanna, whose family house it is, and Danielle, who was a local guy who it's not her husband, it's a guy who works for her in there, taking care of the place, doing work around the house. And it's a delightful place for me to stay because I was one of the few guests there. I had almost the whole house to myself. And it was a very typical house of Merida. It was built around 1910. And back from the street, as most houses in these neighborhoods have, there's a facade that faces the street, but most of the house is hidden behind with terraces and open gardens and roof terraces. It was absolutely gorgeous. This was my room, very comfortable rooms, including some suites, which they, over time, Giovanna has done some renovations. And there are gardens, a swimming pool, plenty of places to just relax, even up on the roof where you can kind of get a view of the neighborhood. And it comes even complete with a local Chihuahua. His name was Zeus, if you can believe it, because he acted a lot bigger than he actually was. And I'm a sucker for any place that has a local dog to visit with. But it was a historic home, and it was kind of nice to stay in a place like that. The ceilings are very high, as you can see here, very typical of houses in Merida because it helps keep them cool. And I got a delicious local breakfast every morning, not to mention just being able to chat with Giovanna. She was raised both in Texas and in Merida, so she had a very interesting perspective on what it was like to grow up in the United States versus in Mexico, and to have a foot in both worlds. So it was very enjoyable to talk to her about her experiences in both places. Anyway, enough of that. It was a great place to stay. I highly recommend it if you ever go there. Outside of the historic center, most of Merida is quite low rise, and you can see a lot of these houses are very similar to the one that I stayed in. They all have those high ceilings, very pretty facade on the street, and gardens in the back. Most of the intersections, interestingly, were kind of cut off, angled at the corner, which is just the local style. And here are some photos of typical streets. It's a beautiful city, a mix of very humble houses or very elegant mansions back from the day when Merida was a very important economic center in the area, full of rich merchants. One thing that I noticed that's kind of fun as you wander around the city is in the old days when literacy was much lower than it is now, many of the streets, which are numbered, Merida has a grid pattern with streets numbered from east to west and north to south. Many of the intersection had signs instead of numbers and writing that related to some sort of landmark or connection to the street that would have been meaningful to people who didn't read. So you can still see a few of those throughout the city, in addition to the modern street signs that all refer to the numbers of the streets. The center of Merida is the Plaza Mayor, and very typical of colonial Spanish cities in Latin America. It's where the cathedral is located. This is La Catedral de San Ildefonso, and many of the other government buildings surround the central plaza. This particular cathedral was constructed very early in 1588 and was built out of a lot of the original Mayan stones that were in Mayan temples and other buildings that were built in the area. This is the interior, which has an unusual stone ceiling and a detail of the front door. And completely surrounding the Plaza Mayor are all the other important buildings in the city. The Palacio de Gobierno, which is from 1892, is the government building for the state of Yucatan. Inside, there's a beautiful public hall upstairs. You can tour these buildings freely. They're open to the public. And upstairs, there's an amazing ceremonial hall that has beautiful murals, mostly from the 1970s. They're pretty recent. And they were done by a local artist. And the subjects they all depict major events in the history of the Yucatan Peninsula. On the right, you can see City Hall. So as opposed to the state of Yucatan, this is the municipal building for the city in this beautiful pink stucco. And like many Mexican cities, there's a colorful name. The city has the name in colorful letters that you can stand in front of and take a selfie with a huge flag. This seems to be a very common thing throughout Latin America. And something typical of this particular area are these fun local sort of dual benches, romantic benches where couples can sit facing each other. It's kind of an interesting local quirk that's fun to see. On another side of the plaza is this old mansion from the 1540s, very early, called Casa Montejo. And originally it was built as a barracks for soldiers, but it was turned into a mansion for the Montejos family, the first of whom was a conquistador who founded the city and, of course, subjugated the locals. And his family was instrumental in the history of the city. You can see up close, if you look here, the facade is very elaborate and includes some kind of gruesome sculptures. Here is a conquistador standing on the heads of the local Maya people, which is not terribly a nice thing to see, but it is the history of the area, for better or for worse. And you can tour this. It is now a museum, a free museum, in fact, where you can see some of the very elaborately decorated rooms from when it belonged to the Montejo family. Here's the dining room. One of the main salons. It's a very nice place to stop in. They even have a little cafe and a beautiful garden in the back off the busyness of the street where you can sit and have a drink. It's a fantastic city to explore if you like architecture and colonial architecture and also just general street life. This beautiful church, which is very close to the main square, was built in 1562, and it's all that's left of an old hospital, which filled the entire city block. The hospital has since disappeared, and this was, for a long time, this church was used as the main church, the main cathedral for Merida, while they were building the big cathedral. And thus it is the oldest church in the city. There's a lot of beautiful architecture downtown. This is the Grand Hotel. And right across the corner from it is another hotel. This is called the Mansion Merida Hotel, a beautiful 19th century mansion that now it's very chic, has only 14 suites, and an elegant restaurant. And even if you don't stay there, you can stick your head in and wander around the interior courtyard where you can see the stairway and all the interior decorations and the magnificent courtyard in the middle that now houses their restaurant. This is very typical of the wealthy mansions that were built in Merida mostly in the 19th century. I'll talk a little bit about the economics of that period in a little bit. So throughout the city, there are these gorgeous 19th century buildings, and also a lot from the 20th century. Also, this Art Deco theater, which was built after World War II, in 1949, is only a block from the main square and still is one of the most popular and busy theaters in the city. There's even a lot of modern architecture. This is the Museo Palacio de Música, which opened in 2018, very recently. It's a music school and also a museum about the history of music in Mexico. So it's worth a visit for that. And the architecture is very dramatic, very distinctly modern, right in the center of this old city. It has this striking courtyard in the middle where you will see a lot of local students hanging around, playing music. And they have performances and so forth there. It's also a nice place to see lit up at night. And just wandering around the city, there's all kinds of stuff to see. It's a great place for walking tours, which you can do on your own, or you can also join a guided walking tour with a local who will take you to places that are of unique historical and architectural significance. This one is nothing in particular. I just happened to walk by it and I loved it. It looks kind of like a Jetsons space age house, and it was for sale. So if you're looking for cheap real estate in Mexico to retire to, you could maybe buy this and fix it up. Which is what someone else did at this house, which is much older. This was built in 1909 for a wealthy merchant back in that time period. It's called the Casa Morisca, meaning the Moorish house. And at one point, it served as the United States consulate in the city, but after a major renovation, it was bought by a private owner. It's not visitable. You can only see the outside. It's privately owned now, and got somewhere around 20, 25 rooms, and it was completely restored by the new owner. So and it's just in a neighborhood, kind of fun to walk by. All over the city, there are incredible colors. On the right here is a sort of boutique hotel in brilliant pink, and apparently they decided it wasn't pink enough, so they were painting it even brighter pink. And I was kind of surprised throughout the whole city. There was a surprising number of paint shops. And after a while, it became obvious why, because they were constantly painting brilliant colors all over the buildings. Another lovely hotel entrance. This imposing building is the public university of Yucatan. Merida is a big university city, and this is the main one. Being a public librarian, I, of course, always have to visit the public library, and this was their central library in this ornate old building. Kind of frumpy on the inside. It looked like it could use a little renovation, but it had a very nice collection, and they did programs, had a little children's room. A nice place to visit. And just to give you a flavor of the architecture throughout the city, here are some examples of the variety of different kinds of houses. Even though most of them, as I mentioned at the beginning, most of them are of a particular type. They are usually about the same width, the same height. They're single-story buildings that go very back far from the street, and most of the life of the house is in the rear, which was open to the sky, had open courtyards and gardens and so forth. But there's a real wide variety of different time periods, different styles, different bright colors, different degrees of renovation. And if you just enjoy strolling around neighborhoods, it was an absolutely wonderful place to visit. One of the reasons why it's such a great place to visit is how safe Merida is. And I'm sure you've probably, if you follow the news at all, you've heard that there's different levels of crime in different parts of Mexico. And there are warnings about traveling in different places. And there are definitely parts of Mexico that you should probably avoid these days because they do have high levels of crime. Yucatan, fortunately, is not one of them. And in fact, Yucatan currently is considered, actually, from the US State Department, the safety rating for Yucatan is actually better than much of Western Europe. And you can travel very safely there, and you can stroll around Merida at all hours of the day or night without being particularly concerned at all. It has very low levels of crime. I felt perfectly safe walking around all by myself, even late at night. And in fact, Merida is so safe that a lot of Mexicans are moving there from other parts of the country because it is doing well economically. It's the center of a very touristy area that is attracting a lot of investment, and it is considered a fairly safe part of the country. So if you're nervous about traveling to Mexico, this is one place that you should not worry about that. And it's worth noting that the United States State Department, when they make their recommendations about where to travel, it's often done at the country level, which can be a little bit misleading because obviously the capital of a country can be completely different from visiting other parts. Mexico, they actually do split up into different regions of the country. So you can hone in on if you're interested in visiting the capital versus Yucatan versus Acapulco, you can specifically find out the details of levels of safety. The biggest issue almost anywhere here is just nonviolent crime. Take care of your belongings, be aware of pickpocketing and that kind of thing in crowds. But other than that, I would say one of the greatest things that I enjoyed about the Yucatan was how completely safe I felt there as a traveler. I'm going to show you a lot of food through this program, so we'll stop for the first time in a restaurant called the Museum of Yucateca Gastronomy. It is a restaurant. It had really good food, but it also has a free museum in the back with a lot of interesting exhibits about traditional crops and food that are grown in the Yucatan. Here's what I had. There's a lot of specifically Yucatecan food, which makes use of local ingredients. Mexico is a big country with a very diverse geography and a lot of diverse culture. So you will find that the food and the local styles are different all over the country. In Yucatan, these fritters, which are made of corn and pumpkin seed and beans, um, are kind of like, well, like any other kind of fritter, a little almost like falafel, you could say. And they're served with pickled onions and a spicy salsa, black beans, and so forth, and tortillas. A very nice appetizer, and a very common thing that is served there, even in hot weather, is something called sopa de lima, which is a chicken soup served with Yucatecan limes, which are a little different from our limes. They are a little more like a key lime. They have a slightly different flavor, and it's often served with these little fried tortilla chips that you soak in the soup until they start to soften a little bit. Really delicious. And this is called pokchuk, which is a thin pork marinated in sour orange juice. Here served with avocados and black bean sauce. Certainly, if you travel there, um, food is one of the most enjoyable parts of traveling there because there's so much to try, particularly things that you may not find in Mexican restaurants here, where things can often be sort of Americanized. Here's another local specialty called cochinita pibil, which is pork. Usually it's pork, sometimes it's poultry, And it's wrapped in banana leaves and slow roasted with vegetables, like you can see here, onions and tomatoes and so forth, and slow roasted in an oven called a pipe, which is why the dish is called pibil. And I finished it off with a flan. I'm definitely a sucker for flan. This is that restaurant, just a view of the courtyard, because many of the restaurants are now housed in what used to be fancy mansions. They often have these beautiful courtyards off the street, so it's kind of quiet. It's away from the hubbub of the busy city streets, and the food is not terribly expensive. You can eat very expensively if you want, but you don't have to. There's a lot of good, cheap street food also, if you're interested, and places that are just local restaurants that cater more to locals and residents rather than tourists. And those are great places to eat as well. I mentioned in the back of this particular restaurant, they have this little museum. It's not very big, but it's designed with traditional houses that are built in the traditional Mayan style, and each one displays something about the history and culture of Yucatecan cuisine and the crops that they grew, which is kind of interesting. Um, at night, the city is just a wonderful place to stroll around. Again, because it's so safe, but also because there's a lot of street activity. There's lots of food stalls. They have music performances and dance performances. Here's the cathedral with that theater again. The city hall, which was all lit up. I was there a couple of weeks before Christmas, so there was also a lot of Christmas decorations up because being a big Catholic country, they really do Christmas. So there was that. Here's the city hall lit up in green. I'm sorry, this is the state house for the state of Yucatan, rather. And right next to the cathedral, unfortunately, they were doing some renovations on it. This beautiful passage next to the cathedral goes from one block to the other, and it's all lit up inside. Unfortunately, the ceiling was covered over because they were replacing the glass roof tiles, but it was still very nice, all lit up. This is the church that was right in my neighborhood. And you can watch the sunset over the plaza, and just stroll around after dinner, have some drinks, walk through the streets. This is that modern music school, which looks very nice at night. The university is lit up. On different nights, for some reason, the city hall changed color every night. Some nights it was green, some nights it was red. I think that was for Christmas. And the markets, which are busy all day long, really come alive at night. This is the main market area, which is just a couple of blocks away from the Plaza Mayor. And the markets are fun for tourists to stroll around, but they're really geared more towards locals, because this is where they would buy fruits and vegetables and food, all kinds of household goods, shoes, clothing, you name it. Because it was the Christmas season, there were carol singers all over the streets. Behind here on the left is a very pretty square with the Church of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Here it is inside. They were actually having services while I walked by. And the entire city was decorated for Christmas, almost every single public square. I even saw a whole bunch of locals, not just these two guys. There were a surprising number of local guys walking around in elf costumes all day long. There's a main drag, which I will talk about in a little bit, and show you what it looks like in the daytime. But it's a very wide public avenue that goes for almost a whole mile through part of the city, and it's completely lit up from one end to the other with where they decorated the street lights. Here's another boutique hotel. And of course, Feliz Navidad. Here's a young girl, a 15-year-old, celebrating her quinceañera, having her photos taken. I might point out, I don't know how you guys feel about it. I hate the Feliz Navidad song with an impassioned hatred. And I actually managed to go through 8 whole days in Mexico without hearing Feliz Navidad until the very last day. Um, but oh well. So it's kind of nice to be there at a time when the city was decked out a little bit more than normal. Um, if you're curious about the best times to travel there, it really depends. In Mexico, it depends a lot on which area because um, there's so much variation in the geography. In Yucatan, the best time to go is probably between December after hurricane season has passed. So like after Thanksgiving and through probably February and into March, which is the driest time of year when there's the least rain. It's still very hot there. I would say most of the time I was there, the temperature was well into the 80s, but comfortable at night, not too hot at night. And also the humidity is lower at that time of year. Once you get into April, the rainy season starts and it rains considerably more from April, May, through fall into October, November. So definitely the best time to be there is December through February, December into March, probably. Here's another restaurant I ate at called Chaya Maya, which is one of the best known restaurants. We're going to eat there a little bit later. Um, and this one, not too far away, is called Casa Maya, which has a funky interior. And a little bit more food to talk about. I had another bowl of sopa de lima because I liked it so much. And on the right is something called tic de venado, which is shredded meat served cold. Often it's pork. It can be beef or chicken, but more often than not, it's pork. And it's served along with things like tomatoes and avocado and onions and radishes and cilantro and tacos, which you can see here, but these are made not from corn or wheat. They're made from black beans. I also had a lot of mojitos. I'm a big fan of those. The big boulevard that I talked about, which is called Paseo de Montejo, named for that family I referred to earlier, where we visited their mansion. The founder of the city. Paseo de Montejo was built in the late 19th century to kind of give the city a very European feel along the line of the Champs-Élysées in Paris. So it's a very long French-style boulevard that goes at least 2 or 3 kilometers from the center of the city to the outskirts. And on Sundays, they close it, or they close half of it, I should say, for pedestrians and cyclists, which is really nice because it fills full of people walking and cycling back and forth. And it's a wonderful place to stroll around, but also because there's a number of important museums and places to see there. It's lined with a lot of very stylish mansions that were built in the late 19th century for very wealthy residents. This one is called the Museo Palacio Canton, which unfortunately is closed for the moment. They're doing big renovations there for a while, and there's no word on when it's going to reopen. But it's the city's anthropological museum, and it's supposed to have fabulous collections. So I was kind of disappointed not to be able to see that. But even the exterior of the building is quite something. It's very European in style and over the top Baroque. And there's a number of other mansions, some of which are still privately owned, and many of which have been turned into restaurants or boutique hotels. This particular one here is now a cultural center where they have art exhibitions. On the left is one that has been turned into a swanky restaurant. The orange one on the right is a branch of a bank, of all things, in a very Spanish colonial style. This one, I wondered what it was. It seemed open. You could wander into the garden, but there was no sign telling you what it was. So I kind of felt funny walking around. I asked it when I got back to my hotel. Um, and the host of my hotel said, "Oh, it's an insurance office, and you can wander in. They don't mind." But this is another one that used to be a mansion. This one you can actually visit. This is called Quinta Montes Molina, and is now a house museum that was built in 1902. One of the many wealthy families that became important in that time period, 120, 30, 50 years ago, during an economic boom due to the selling of something called henequen. Henequen is a type of, it's a plant, but it's also, we often call it sisal. It's a type of plant where they strip it, they strip the plant, and it forms an extremely strong fiber that can be used in making ropes. And for a long time, it was an extremely important crop in the 19th century, both used locally and exported. So there were henequen plantations throughout the Yucatan, and the families, most of whom, of course, were from European stock. The families grew immensely wealthy from the henequen boom, and built these elaborate mansions in the city as well as haciendas out in the countryside. So they would have a city house and a country home. But that's where most of their money came from. And this particular one is a nice house to visit to see a little bit about what that lifestyle was like. It's also important because it's full of the original furnishings, which isn't always the case for places like this. This is completely furnished because the people who lived in it up until like the 1980s left it as a house museum, and all their original furnishings are still there. In fact, in the kitchen, you can see there's a historical kitchen into the basement, but it was because it was lived in relatively recently, they had a fairly modern stove. Not only can you visit it as a museum, but it's now used for events and weddings and things like that. If you walk all the way up this street, you will come to a big intersection, sort of a big roundabout that has a Monumento a la Patria, which was constructed after World War II to commemorate Mexican history, and in particular, Yucatecan history and pride in the local culture. So it definitely looks post-World War II, but it's a fairly dramatic monument. It has a fountain in the middle that wasn't working when I was there. Walking down the other side of the street, here's a number of other mansions. This one could use some renovation. These were actually relatively new apartments that were built in a Moorish style, even though they look like they're hundreds of years old. And there's modern stuff, trendy cafes. I liked that you could get both Korean grill and ice cream in the same place. And another place that's well worth a visit is another house museum called Las Casas Gemelas, which is twin mansions. There's actually two built right next to each other for two brothers. These were built around 1910 in the Beaux-Arts style. If you visited any of the Newport mansions down in Rhode Island, they definitely have that style to them and are about the same size. You can see here they're identical and right next door to each other, one for each brother. The one on the right is still privately owned by the family, but the left one has been turned into a museum, which you can now visit and see, again, in the style of the Newport mansions, what it was like to live as an extremely wealthy family in Merida 100 years ago. And again, like the other house I showed you, most of it has the original furnishings from the family. There's an amazing stained glass dome over the central hall, and the whole style of the mansion is very French. The stairway is the highlight, of course. And it's kind of funny because you might think this was a big wealthy family full of all kinds of people, but at the end, late in the 20th century, there were only two sisters living here, all by themselves in this humongous house, far outnumbered by the staff that had to take care of it. Here's the billiard room, and on the right, an interesting early phone that linked. You can see kind of at the top, there's this little switch that swung back and forth from left to right. This phone was it wasn't connected to a phone system in the country. All it connected was the houses that were outside of the city. There were two haciendas that this family owned in the countryside. And depending on which way you flip that switch, you could talk to either one or the other of the haciendas. That's all it did. But it was fairly advanced technology for its time. The dining room with this monumental chandelier, and the kitchens again down in the basement. Although the basement for many of these mansions wasn't completely underground. It was built partially underground, but with enough windows. This is a very tropical climate, of course, so it gets hot, particularly in a kitchen where you're cooking food. So having an easy way to air out with cross ventilation was very important in the way the buildings were designed. Merida never really had protective walls like some other cities that were built by the Spanish as colonial centers. They had thought about it at some point, but it never happened. However, there are a few gates, these arched gates that still remain in the areas where the walls would have been built, and you can run into them every now and then as you walk around. There's a beautiful old train station, which has been, there are no trains here anymore, unfortunately. But the train station has been turned into a beautiful new, kind of like an arts exhibition center. And behind it, the old train shed now has public art in it, and it connects to an incredible new park, which is very recent, only built in the past few years. It's, I forget how big it is, but it's huge. All the old train yards that would have taken up an enormous amount of space behind the train station are now a public park where they planted 3,000 trees. It has an elevated walkway, kind of like the High Line in New York. There are swimming areas, pools, exercise areas. They have a cycling track, playgrounds for kids, an amphitheater. I was the only person silly enough to walk on the upper level where it's sunny and hot. All of the sensible Mexicans were walking underneath in the shade, which makes more sense. And they saved a lot of the old rail cars, which is kind of fun because they're all on display and they've been repurposed as cafes or gift shops from different time periods. When the government did this project, all the surrounding neighborhood houses were repainted as part of the project to spiff them up and make the area look nice. And I was reminded on this street, just walking around, I don't know why, but Merida is absolutely loaded with old classic VW Beetles. Almost every street has one of them. And this was a reminder of that. Another major site that's probably, if you're going to go to one museum anywhere in the city, this is the one you should visit. Unfortunately, it's a little on the outskirts. I took an Uber. It's a few kilometers out of the center. It's called the Gran Museo del Mundo Maya, which opened in 2012. You can see this very modern building. It was 2012 is a very important date in the ancient Mayan calendar. If you remember that time period, there was a lot of hoo-ha about how the world was going to end because the ancient Mayans predicted that was the end of the calendar. As you recall, absolutely nothing happened. And in fact, even in the Mayan mythology and calendar system, all it means is that they start a new calendar period after that. But the one thing that did happen is they opened this amazing museum, which has fantastic collections of Mayan art, and it's a very good way uh, to get sort of an overview of the entire history of Mayan culture in one place. Their permanent collection includes hundreds of artifacts from all the different periods of Mayan history. There's a lot of really nice audiovisual presentations, models, very good overview of Mayan culture. And especially if you don't have a chance to go visit some of the actual ruins, this is a good way to get a feel for the history of the area. This particular artifact is very interesting. This is one of the few examples of actual Mayan writing, because when the Spanish arrived here, they destroyed a lot of, they actually burned a lot of the artifacts that they found to completely eliminate Mayan culture. Not only did they tear down Mayan buildings and rebuild Spanish colonial buildings out of the old stones, but they eliminated a lot of ephemeral stuff that was not carved in stone. So unfortunately, a lot of original documents that would have been terribly important for historians and archaeologists disappeared, which is a shame. But this is one of the few remaining examples of actual Mayan writing, which was a sort of mix of kind of like a hieroglyphic system. They even had a numerical system, which you can see here. A line meant 5 and a dot meant a single number. So this would refer to the down here where you see a line with 4 dots above it is the number 9. 5 plus 4. 5 and 5 is 10, and so forth. So dates and historical numbers, all once they interpreted this system, they were able to glean a lot of information from the documents. And when I show you some archaeological ruins, you will see that a lot of this style is duplicated on the carved in stone on the side of the Mayan ruins that still exist. I should talk a little bit about Mayan culture today also, because it still exists. There are still today in Central America, there are about 6 million Mayan people, ethnically Mayan. The vast majority of them live in the Yucatan. There's a few in other parts of Mexico and also in Guatemala and Honduras, the areas that were historically Mayan. And there are a number of them even in the United States. Unfortunately, not too many of them still speak Mayan, but the language exists. And I wanted to show you here. This is an example of a sign in the museum that explains on the left in Spanish, and on the right you can see the equivalent in Maya, which looks like it's from another planet, because of course it has absolutely no connection to any kind of European language. It's a local indigenous language. And it's still spoken. Daniela, who was the guy who worked at the guest house that I stayed at, is Mayan, and he speaks a Mayan dialect, and he made a feeble attempt every morning at breakfast to teach me a couple of words, and it was useless because I don't remember any of them. And he also explained to me that even today, there are about 20 different Mayan dialects that are spoken throughout this area of Central America. And they are, although there are some similarities, they are not necessarily mutually intelligible. And part of that is because historically they could be quite isolated from one another. So they develop differently. And interestingly, even in Yucatan, Mayan is not taught in schools. There they are most likely, students are most likely to obviously learn Spanish, Spanish grammar and language, and also English, which is obviously very useful. But Mayan is mostly learned at home if you come from a family that has that background. Here's another, this is a carving of a jaguar. Take note of this, the figure in this picture, because we're actually going to visit the temple it comes from in a little bit, and you can see where it would have fit on the building. This is also an illustration of a frieze that would have been on a Mayan temple. This particular one depicts a Mayan ruler carrying the cut-off head of a ball player. We're going to talk about that in a little bit too. The Mayans were a particularly gruesome culture in many ways. And this also is an opportunity to point out that the ruins that you will see, which are just stone, carved limestone, would have originally been painted, much like ruins in ancient Greece and Rome, which are now mostly just plain white marble. They were also originally painted when they were first built. And that was true of the Mayans as well. If you're interested in Mayan culture, I have a book recommendation for you on the left by Michael Coe, who is a fairly well-known Mayan archaeologist and historian. His book on the Mayan is I found a particularly readable, it's a textbook, but it's very accessible for the layperson. And if you want kind of an overview of the history and the different, the culture, the religion, the calendar system, and so forth, it's very readable, I think, if you're interested in pursuing it further. The reclining figure on the right that has kind of a plate, holding a plate on his stomach, is called a Uxmal figure. And you will find those in a number of different places in Central America. It was a standard design that was depicted as a figure that would hold some kind of sacrificial offering on the plate that he holds on his stomach, sometimes a human offering, human sacrifice. Another book that's worth making reference to this is a very early edition of a book by an American named John Lloyd Stevens, who traveled through this part of Central America in the 1840s with a British guy named Frederick Catherwood. And they were among the earliest non-locals to explore the ruins. Obviously, the ruins were well known. They weren't a big secret. The locals had known about them for centuries, even though they might be overgrown. But they really hadn't been documented in a professional way by historians and archaeologists. And these guys were among the first to do that. Stevens was the writer, and Frederick Catherwood, the Brit, was an illustrator. And their book together was a huge bestseller in the 19th century. And this is, you can actually read it. There's part of the museum also has contemporary exhibits as well, temporary exhibitions. This one showed a lot of folk art from contemporary artists that are working in the Yucatan today, which was also very interesting to see. These amazingly decorated gourds. The larger one, to give you an idea of size, it's about the size of a basketball, and they're covered with gold. They're incredibly detailed, which made me hungry. So here's some more food. Back at the restaurant, I think I showed you the outside a little earlier. This is called chaya maya. Chaya is the name of a particular kind of plant. It's a tree. It's called tree spinach, and you can see a leaf here on the plate. It tastes a little bit like spinach. It cooks a little bit like spinach. It's a slightly different flavor, but I had fish that was made with a chaya sauce, sort of a pureed cream sauce, and salad and all the accompaniments, and of course a mojito to go with it. And this was another restaurant that I ate in that had a beautiful courtyard. And this one was in a plaza this was probably the fanciest restaurant I ate in. I treated myself here. Not exactly traditional food. It's kind of modernized Yucatan food and fusion with other cultures, but oh boy, was it good. This dish here is a kind of not exactly traditional relleno negro, which are little roll-ups um, made with a sauce, again made of black beans and some charred chilies, um, with with another mojito. And it looked out onto a really nice plaza that had music going on. It was delicious, and quite enjoyable. This is one of the best ceviches I've ever had. I'm a big fan of ceviche, and I tended to try it in most of the restaurants I went to. And I finished it off with beef mole, which had this squash puree. Very fancy presentation. There's a lot of good restaurants all over Merida. And as I said, you shouldn't feel you can eat very well there, but you don't have to. You can eat in very inexpensive restaurants where the locals eat for just a few dollars, and the food is still perfectly good. Depends on what you're into. There's a whole district. This street is called the Gastronomy District that has a lot of trendy restaurants. Back in the shopping area, here's block after block of market stalls, cheap places to eat. There's a lot of very fancy boutique shops, trendy upscale places, and then the local places that just sell street food, traditional crafts for tourists. A lot of ceramics is very popular in Merida. This building with this beautiful balcony is in what used to be the post office, and they've turned it into a museum of the history of the city, which is well worth it for the air conditioning and also for their exhibits. It's also free, which makes it a nice diversion for an hour or so. They have some really good exhibits on the founding of the city, the growth of the city over time, pre-Columbian, pre-Spanish, right up until the modern period. And they also had some nice contemporary exhibits of local artists. And the building alone is worth sticking your head in because it's a good example of a beautiful old public building. This is it from the outside, looking out over the market district. And I love public markets in foreign countries because you can see where people buy their fruits and vegetables and meats, fish, also clothing, not to mention cheap knockoffs of international brands like Tommy Halfmaker. Some parts of it are not for the squeamish. This is the meat section. If you continue past that district where all the market is, there's a nice little neighborhood that's very quiet, has some pretty churches. I loved this one. This is St. John the Baptist, set in a very lovely park. And inside it has a very typical ceiling that is common in Yucatan church architecture with these beams, wooden beams. And I love this sign. This was actually in the church, where I don't know if they actually have a problem with people doing this during church services or not, but they felt the need to put up a sign. Just a few more examples of what it's like to stroll around the city. Elegant homes, beautiful colors, plenty of churches, most of which seem to be yellow. That seems to be the default color for churches. This one is called the Hermitage of St. Isabel, which was had a very cool and shady botanical garden behind it. But it's a photographer's dream, Merida. There's just color everywhere you look. Here's a mural of a jaguar. And there's a park. There's a number of pretty parks. This is the biggest one, kind of on the edge of the city, called the Parque del Centenario, which is mostly aimed at kids. It has a little train, and there's a small, rather sad zoo, but it's fun, and there's places to get ice cream. If nothing else, it's a pleasant place to stroll if it's really hot out. And just by way of showing you that not everything is low-rise, there are a few places, mostly downtown, but a few other places in the city where here's an example of an old mansion that has been nicely restored, but they built a high-rise hotel in the back of it. It's not terribly common. Most of the city is still low-rise. And also just to show you that not everything has been completely gentrified. There are plenty of places that still look like this and could use a little fixing up. I'm still hungry, so here's another restaurant. This was probably the most delicious beet soup, cream of beet soup I have ever had in my life. I don't know what spices they had in it, but I loved it. And this is a local specialty called Lomitos de Valladolid, which we're actually going to go to Valladolid. It's a town a couple hours away. We're going to visit it shortly. This is pork, which is in a sort of garlicky tomato sauce. Just a hint of spice, but not too spicy if you don't like spicy. Very delicious. And I foolishly ordered a meringue cake for dessert, which could easily have served 2 to 3 people. But I took one for the team and ate the whole thing. Okay, we've covered the city. I need to take you out of the city. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the history of the Maya, but I need to give you a little background, an overview. Again, we're up here in the northern part of the flat part of the Yucatan Peninsula. And you've probably heard of several different empires that were in Central America at different points. The Maya were mostly in what is now Yucatan and southern Mexico, also Belize, the modern country of Guatemala, and a little bit into Honduras and El Salvador. That was the focus. It started mostly in the south, in the highlands, which is very mountainous, and then slowly over time moved up into the flat lowlands. The other places that you've probably heard of, cultures that you've heard of, are the original Toltec, the Olmecs. That was the culture that had the big heads that they found in the jungle, and eventually the Aztecs, which were much later and were much more in the north, around where the modern capital of Mexico City is located. And there was some overlap with all of these different cultures, but the Maya were probably the longest lived. They went back quite early, a couple of millennia BC, but much of the ruins that you are likely to visit today, that you can still see as an archaeological site, were later. Most of those were in the modern AD period, from about 300 BC at the earliest up to about 900 AD, when the supposed collapse of the Mayan civilization occurred. And that's a hotly contested question in archaeology, because the Mayan culture continued for quite a bit after its supposed collapse. It didn't collapse all at once, and it's not really clear. Nobody really knows what happened to the Mayans. It was probably no one factor. It was a mix of wars between different city-states. It was probably affected by climate change. There were some definitely very big and long-lasting drought periods, which would have affected the climate and the availability of water and the growing of crops. So nobody really knows. And that's something that over time, archaeologists will learn more and more, and hopefully learn a little bit more about that. But something that I think is important to emphasize is that the Maya were not really an empire the way they are often referred to. They were more a collection of independent city-states that were culturally very similar and traded with each other, fought with each other, took over each other, but they were not a centralized empire the way some other cultures were, like the Aztecs later. So that's the 60-second history of the Mayans. Another excellent book that I would recommend, I talked earlier about those two guys, the American and the British guy who uh, wandered around and explored in the 19th century. If you can read their actual book, if you want to read the 19th century chronicle, but I found even more interesting is a much more recent book, came out maybe 10 years ago, called Jungle of Stone, which is a book about um, their explorations. If you like Indiana Jones, or if you read, there was a really good book called The Lost City of Z, which came out a few years ago as well, that was about the exploration of the Amazon. If you like that kind of archaeological adventure story, you'll love this. And it talks about their explorations. It also includes a lot of reproductions of Catherwood's drawings. This is a good example of his very detailed illustrations. This is the main temple at Chichen Itza. So it's a really fun read. If you want to travel around the Yucatan, there is, literally as of this past fall, it finally opened. The Tren Maya opened, I think, in October or November, and is a high-speed rail system that goes all the way around the Yucatan and connects the major cities, and connects the major archaeological sites, including Cancun, Tulum, Merida, all the way to Palenque. And it's a good way of getting around if you are interested in traveling quickly and comfortably. It's not terribly expensive. The only disadvantage to it, and I didn't take it for this reason, is that most of the train stations are actually fairly far from the center of the places that they're going, because it was built so recently. So the Tren Maya station for Merida is actually many kilometers outside the center of the city. So you really would need to take a bus, or an Uber or something to get there, then take the Tren Maya all the way over to Chichen Itza, where the station is also far from the ruins, and you would have to take local transportation to get there. So it's great, and at the same time not entirely convenient. But it is certainly a good new infrastructure for helping tourism in the area. The big site, by far the biggest site and the most visited, is Chichen Itza. The Itza people did not actually arrive here until about the 12th century. So this is actually a much later site in the long history of Mayan culture. And architecturally, it seems to have been significantly influenced by the Toltec culture, which was up the coast to the north. You really can't go to the Yucatan and not see Chichen Itza, but it is very popular and very crowded and very touristy. So just be aware of that. It's still worth the visit. The two things that I would recommend if you go there is, one, go very early in the morning. Be there the first thing when it opens, because you'll avoid a little bit of the crowds, and also it's not as hot. So you'll be able to see more of it before you get into the heat of midday. The other thing I would recommend is go for a longer period of time. I was there for the better part of a day, but it was not enough. I could easily have spent 2 full days seeing everything that the place had to offer. You can easily go on your own, or you can hire a guide, or there are all kinds of tours that will take you. A driver will take you from Merida or from Cancun, and it makes an easy day trip, whether you want to rent a car and do it on your own, or whether you want to hire somebody. But I think I regret not spending more time there. And it's kind of ironic, because Chichen Itza, as famous as it is, it's sort of the iconic site. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's probably one of the most visited archaeological sites in all of Central America. And ironically, it's probably one of the least Mayan of the Mayan archaeological sites, because it was, because of the time period, it was heavily influenced by non-Mayan cultures. The big site, the biggest building in in the complex is called El Castillo, the castle. It's the tallest building in Chichen Itza, about 80 feet high. And it really is incredibly imposing. It's an amazing site. It's a typical four-sided pyramid with a temple on the top, and it has stairways with multiple levels. Most of the sites that you see, certainly in Chichen Itza and a lot of the other archaeological sites, you can no longer climb the temples. And that's actually a good thing. You might be disappointed, but the good thing is it means you can do some great photography without having tourists climbing all over it. And of course, it was done mainly to protect the monuments, because these are all made of limestone, and limestone is a fairly soft stone. So with literally thousands and thousands of people climbing up and down, it can over time damage them. So I think it was a good decision to reduce the traffic on them. You probably also know that the Mayan culture was very advanced in terms of mathematics and also astronomy. So many of the pyramids that you see, like this one, were aligned astronomically with for the solstice or the equinox, which were important parts of their calendar system. I can't show it to you now, but I will refer you to, if you go to YouTube and Google Chichen Itza equinox, you will see some cool videos on the equinox. The shadow of the sun comes down and makes a sort of snake-like shadow all the way down. There is actually a snakehead sculpture at the bottom, and it's quite dramatic if you see the time lapse of the sun coming down the monument only at that particular time of year. Chichen Itza is not as highly decorated as some of the other archaeological sites, again, because of the time period, but it still has some very impressive carvings, typical of Mayan style. Here's just one of the smaller temples. And almost every major Mayan site has something called a ball court. The one at Chichen Itza is the largest in Central America, and it was used for a game, and I put the word game in quotes because it really wasn't a sport. It was almost a religious ceremony, a ritual that was played with a heavy rubber ball. You can see the size of, given the human beings here, you can see just how big this court was. The important dignitaries would be on top observing it from the walls up high, and the players had the point of the game was to get this very heavy rubber ball through this carved stone ring on either side of the court. And it was a little bit like highlight, from what they understand of it. You could use different parts of your body. It actually, it's the rules of the game were kind of like Quidditch from Harry Potter, if you're familiar with that, except for the part where you're not flying around in the air on broomsticks. And except that in the Mayan culture, they also had human sacrifice, which didn't happen in Harry Potter. This is a frieze on a nearby temple depicting the winners or losers, depending on your perspective, of the game. It's still not entirely clear from the archaeologists. At the end of each one of these games, there was one of the players was sacrificed, and it certainly doesn't make much sense to sacrifice your best player. So historians are not entirely clear. There's some dispute as to whether exactly what the criteria were for deciding who would be sacrificed and who would be memorialized on temples like this. They also did human sacrifices here. This is called the cenote. We're going to see some more of those in a minute on the northern edge of the site, down underneath the water. This is a natural, a sinkhole essentially in the limestone that where the ceiling collapsed in, and it's now filled with open water. They found more than 200 human remains in this particular cenote. Uh, the other thing I didn't love about Chichen Itza was that unfortunately the site is completely overrun with vendors selling crafts, some of which are actually very nice, but some of it's kind of tacky, and I do feel it took a little bit away from the experience of the place. Although, of course, in history, back in historical times, Chichen Itza was a very busy place with hundreds of people walking around. It was not a city in the modern sense. Here is another temple called the Temple of Warriors, with jaguar sculptures up on the top. And an area called the Temple of the Thousand Columns. There aren't actually 1,000, but it seems almost like that. Probably it had some sort of roof that was not made of stone, so it didn't survive. And these columns, not all of them, but many of them are actually carved with depictions of individual warriors with individual facial features. So this whole complex that you visit in Chichen Itza now was really more of a ceremonial place. It's where the leaders of the culture lived. It's where the governing dignitaries lived. It's where the religious leaders lived. And it's where the temples where ceremonies took place were. But ordinary Mayan people did not live here. They lived on the outskirts, which extended extensively throughout the surrounding area. And most of those places have disappeared into the jungle because they were not made of stone. They were made of mud brick with thatched roofs, which did not survive centuries and centuries of tropical jungle. This building here, this is the observatory, which is the only circular structure, and it is also aligned astronomically. They do have a couple of places where you can see recreations of a typical Mayan house. And you will see these in the countryside even today. People still live in them in the more rural areas. So all of the stone ruins that I showed you before would have really been for the elites in the city. But the ordinary people who farmed and worked and built things would have lived in structures like this that were spread out through the countryside, and all of their traces have disappeared. Many tours of Chichen Itza will stop at one of the many nearby cenotes, where they're very popular for swimming, and often have tourist facilities where you can get, where there's cafes and restaurants and so forth nearby. This is one where we stopped. I'll show you some more of that in a minute. I laughed over, this was in the restroom at the restaurant. I think this thipping culture is getting a little bit out of control. So what I would recommend if you travel there is see Chichen Itza because you have to, but make a point to go to some of the other sites because surprisingly few people go to a lot of the other places. And the one that I enjoyed the best was called Uxmal, which is also very close to Merida, only barely an hour away, and has no vendors selling tourist stuff, and had almost no tourists. We had the place almost completely to ourselves. It has even certainly as imposing and impressive monuments as well as really incredible decorations. Uxmal in the ancient language means built 3 times, meaning that over its long history, there was an early Uxmal, and then it was completely redone, and they built more stuff on top of it, and then they did it again. So most of what you see is from the 9th century AD in what's called the Puk style, but the site was abandoned not too long after that. The highlight is actually the very first thing when you walk into the site is called the Pyramid of the Magician, which is unusual in that it has a very elliptical base rather than the 4-sided pyramid. It's 125 feet high, so it's actually quite a bit higher than the one at Chichen Itza. And here you can see a lot of the decoration is much more elaborate, and you can also get up much closer to it than at Chichen Itza. And you see here some good examples These hook-nosed masks represent the rain god Chaak. If you buy a decent guidebook, you can learn a lot about this. Even better is to hire a local Mayan guide who can explain to you a lot of the iconography that you'll see and what the buildings were used for. This is the back of the temple, which is actually the front. Where you enter the complex, you're actually seeing the rear of the temple. This is what would have been considered the main entrance. And you can actually see multiple stairways. There are 3 levels because over time they expanded the temple and just built on top of what was originally there. At the very top, it's hard to see from here, but that depicts the mouth of a monster. You can't really, it's kind of hard to see unless you're really close up. This is what I thought was originally a stone carving in the shape of an iguana until I discovered it was a real iguana. You will see a lot of iguanas wandering around. There's a big quadrangle at Uxmal that is called the Nunnery. It was named that by the Spanish just because it was a big square plaza, kind of like in a monastery where there were a lot of very small rooms. It almost certainly had nothing to do with being used for a monastic purpose. But it's a very impressive part of the complex with unbelievably elaborate decorations, including a lot of snakes, like this one you can see here. And although it isn't a nunnery, there were nuns. I thought these were the most picturesque nuns, just strolling around the jungle. And of course, Uxmal also had its own ball court, like most Mayan cities. Uxmal is much smaller than the one at Chichen Itza, but it's the same arrangement, and it was used for the same purpose and has the same kind of ring goal. There are many different temples throughout the complex. This one was called the Dovecote, not because it actually kept doves or pigeons here, but just because it looks like that. It has these intricate pyramids with holes. And this is what's called the Great Pyramid at Uxmal, typical of the Puuc style in that it was built on top of an enormous artificial platform. They built a huge mound on top of which, of earth, on top of which they built the temple. And then on the top of that, they built buildings on top of the stairways. And it has all kinds of intricate decorations. There's a small temple called the House of the Turtles, because there are life-size turtles carvings all the way around the building. And your reward, if you climb all the way to the top, is this spectacular view out over the jungle. Bear in mind that Yucatan is flat as a pancake. So if you get up high enough, you can see for miles in every direction over the jungle. And this is the pyramid that we saw a few minutes ago, the oval-shaped one, rising up above the foliage. Here is the exact same view drawn by Catherwood in the 1840s. So you can see that big nunnery complex, so-called, along with the temple when they first encountered it in the jungle over 150 years ago. There's also a building called the Governor's Palace at the top, which is on an even larger platform with just mind-bogglingly intricate carvings that are nothing like anything you've seen in other cultures. If you've traveled around the world and seen archaeological sites, it's kind of fun to see something that's just different. This looks nothing like what you see in Asia. It looks nothing like what you see in Europe. It's uniquely American, and it's kind of fun to see that. This is a throne with a double-headed jaguar and a view of the entire complex. This is actually a slightly different complex, a little bit south of Uxmal, which you can often see them together since they're so close. It's called Kaba, and was connected by an elevated road through the jungle. Here you can actually climb. Very few people visit this place, so you're able to explore it without all the crowds. And it is still an active archaeological zone, so there's a lot that they're still excavating. You remember earlier when I showed you in the museum that figure, this is where he's from. This particular building is once had 7 of these large, much larger than life-size human sculptures along the top frieze. So one of them is in the museum and the rest of them are still on site. And you can also see a highlight at this particular complex is this grand arch, which is about 6 meters high, so like at least 20 feet, give or take, that was at the north entrance to the city. And if you stand in the middle of it, you can look into the jungle on this elevated roadway, which is completely straight as an arrow and heads north to Uxmal. This was called a sakbe. And connected, you could probably, it would easily have been on foot. You could move between the cities in a matter of a few hours. It was a way to get from one place to another. There are a number of these throughout the jungle in what used to be the Mayan area. And it's interesting that a lot of how they're discovering this is through a technology called LiDAR, where airplanes fly over the jungle, very dense jungle, and use lasers to measure the distance to the ground. And the good thing about that is it eliminates all of the foliage. So you can actually see the underlying landscape of the ground itself. And that shows very clearly under all of the jungle foliage where there are roadways, where there are building structures, where there are foundations. So that fairly recent technology has greatly advanced the exploration of the area in a jungle environment where it's very hard to get up close to things. In fact, this photo, you can see a couple rocks here. What you can't tell is that we are right next to the largest unexcavated pyramid in this site. And you could easily walk by it without ever knowing that there's an enormous pyramid here. It has yet to be cleared. So it's part of the ongoing excavations there. But the jungle grows so quickly here that you can easily walk by an incredibly important monument without knowing it until it's been excavated. Leaving the Mayans and coming a little bit more to the modern day, I visited a couple of very nice colonial towns that are very easy to get to from Merida.